Hallelujah. Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. Welcome to the program. This is Josiah with Integrity Syndicate. We are live. Today I'm taking a deep dive into the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John. Welcome to the program. This will be an eye-opening experience for many of you. This is something I've been aware about for some time. And we're going to go beneath the surface. We're going to dive deep into the structure, the cryptic nature, the symbolism that's interwoven into John, the way it's the template for John, the way it's framed. We're gonna see what's going on with John, with this fourth gospel, this favorite gospel of the Gnostics, and we're gonna see why it's their favorite gospel. So we have a choice. So a difficult choice is before you. There's two paths here in terms of going with what you've been told, following the crowd, following the tradition, or examining critically the tradition and understanding that there's more to it than meets the eye. It's a difficult choice because it's always uncomfortable to challenge your preconceived ideas and notions, things that you've taken for granted for so many years. It's uncomfortable to deconstruct in any way, to examine those presuppositions that you've taken without much question. You can take the blue pill and remain a slave to the illusion. Take the red pill and become a slave to reality. Take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. Take the red pill. You see how deep the rabbit hole goes. It's so comfortable in the blue pilled world where everything is familiar and there's no perception as reality, and you just go on in your comfort zone, living out life as you've known it. Well, let's dive into the matrix. Let's dive in. Looking at John, this is the template, this is the structure of John. You can see there's an introduction, the first chapter, and an epilogue, the last chapter, and there's two major sections in John. The first is chapters 2 through 10, which is the book of signs, commonly understood as, and the latter chapter is the book of glory. And there's this pivotal transition story in the middle, and everything hinges around this raising of Lazarus. It's so pivotal in the story. It parallels the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. It's instrumental in terms of the interwoven symbolism that's played out in the book of glory. And we can see how the raising of Lazarus being the center of the gospel, the glue that holds the two books together, is so critical. And within this template, you have this. You have content, you have stories, you have narrations, you have pictures, you have themes, you have symbolism, you have concepts, constructions. It's an engineered literary masterpiece. But before we go there, let's take a step back. I'd like to read a quote from Richard Balcom from his book, Gospel of Glory. This is a quote that Tim Mackie refers to in his presentation. So Richard Balcom says, "The Gospel of John is a text that constantly creates the impression that more is going on than immediately meets the eye. The author deploys the power of metaphor and symbol in a masterful way, so that the stories and teachings of Jesus are constantly and mutually illuminated by referring to other texts within the book. Each story has been coordinated with other parts of the narrative so that the stories acquire more layers of meaning than the surface one. John is a master of irony, so the characters constantly say more than they intend, and sometimes even the opposite of what they mean. Jesus is constantly consistently, not constantly, but consistently. The theme of misunderstanding repeats itself 18 times in the gospel, foregrounding the question of what the true meaning of his words. He continues to say, the gospel is also shot through with internal connections to the Hebrew Bible that expand the meaning of any given story when they are observed and pondered. This book was written not only to make some sense to first-time readers, but it was also designed to be studied in order to yield its full cornucopia of meaning to the most attentive of students, only to the most attentive of students. Its frequently riddling character is meant to tease the intelligence and entice its readers into the world of multi-dimensional meaning. So you can see why this was the Gnostics' favorite gospel. Layers of meaning, interwoven themes, intertextual connections, so many layers integrated into it. So again, here is another way of presenting the structure. Again, the Book of Signs, the first half, the Book of Glory, the second half. And in the prologue, and you have, in this first half, you have two groups of portraits, of 4 portraits. The first being Jewish institutions, the second group of 4 being Jewish festivals, and then the transition story of Lazarus to the Book of Glory. And so what Tim Mackie does is he kind of takes this format and he presents it in a more pictorial way. So Tim Mackie is the pastor, professor, and writer and podcaster who's really well known. In 2013, he co-founded an animation studio called Bible Project, which creates short animated videos about books and themes of the Bible. He has the Bible Project has 13 YouTube channels in different languages, 3.2 million subscribers, and 300 million plus views. So I'm going to let Tim Mackie do most of the talking in terms of, and I'm going to do it's sort of like a response video to what he's presenting, and he's just going to lay it all out. I'll start with his clips. So the first set of clips are going to be from an animated 2-part series on the Gospel of John.
At the end of the book that it comes from one of Jesus' closest followers called the disciple whom Jesus loved. Now he appears many times in the story itself, and there's some debate about whether it's John the son of Zebedee, one of the 12, or a different John who lived in Jerusalem and was known in the later church as John the Elder.
So first, the authorship is addressed, as you see here in the corner. There's some confusion about which John is this. Is this John the Apostle or John the Elder son? So that's the first thing he notes, that it's probably one of those 2 Johns.
And it's been brilliantly designed. The book's design is really cool. Its first half opens with an introductory poem and a short story that's followed by then a big block of stories about Jesus performing miraculous signs that generate increasing controversy. And it all culminates in his greatest sign, the raising of Lazarus, which creates the greatest controversy as Israel's leaders decide to kill Jesus.
Note the greatest sign in the Gospel of John being the raising of Lazarus, which creates the greatest controversy. In the Gospel of John, Jesus' death is attributed to this sign, this miracle. And because it's so pivotal in the cause of his death, it should be incorporated in the synoptics, but it's not.
And that launches into the book's second half. These chapters focus on Jesus' final night and last words to his disciples, which are followed by his arrest, trial, death, and resurrection. The book concludes with an epilogue.
Okay, so within that structure, we'll see some pieces of the structure. And first, he's going to address the first chapter.
We then start to hear a story about how John the Baptist first met Jesus and then led other people to meet him and become his disciples. And one by one, as people encounter Jesus, they say out loud who they think he is. And in this one chapter, Jesus is given 7 titles.
So we see in the very first chapter, by the mouths of John the Baptist and his disciples as they're being recruited, these titles are being given. And the motivation here is obviously to introduce these titles as pertaining to Jesus right off the bat, so that these titles can be reintroduced and emphasized throughout the book. The problem is, in the Synoptics, Peter doesn't acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah till later, and there's no indication of John calling Jesus the Lamb of God or the Son of God. And so these titles are just introduced for our sake, so that we can see these titles being applied throughout the rest of the gospel. Obviously, it's engineered that way as an introduction, as opposed to conveying historical narrative, an accurate historical narrative.
These titles prepare us for John's love of sevens in designing the book. And John will now go on to support it through the stories in chapters 2 through 12. They all have the same basic pattern. Jesus will perform a sign or make a claim about himself, and that will result in misunderstanding or controversy.
So here you have, this red circle here, you have the whole theme of misunderstanding that Tim Mackie clearly identifies as being an integral part of the gospel. And Dustin Smith and others have identified, and confirmed that there's, 18 occurrences of this theme of misunderstanding, where Jesus says something ambiguous. His disciples or his enemies, whoever's listening to him, misunderstands him. And throughout the dialogue, there's some need of clarification. Sometimes it's explicit, sometimes it's more subtle, the clarification. And because of this theme of misunderstanding, the gospel itself leads itself to misunderstanding. And it's been the cause of endless speculation and confusion throughout the centuries. And because of that, John has been used and misunderstood to support theologies like the Trinity, modalism, or Arianism of Jesus pre-existing. But we know that because there's this theme of misunderstanding, that we're not supposed to take Jesus's words literally. We're supposed to dig beneath the surface and say, in what symbolic or allegorical way are these things true, without them not necessarily being literally true? This theme of misunderstanding is a principal theme, motif in John, that we don't see in the Synoptics.
The first section shows Jesus encountering 4 classic Jewish institutions, and in each case, Jesus shows that he is the reality to which that institution pointed.
So in this first part of the Book of Signs, there's 4 institutions in which these portraits are being illustrated. And so the purpose of these signs and these scenes is a symbolic illustration of who Jesus is, as opposed to just reporting that Jesus performed these miracles in a more spontaneous and organic way.
After this, John has designed another collection of stories that took place during 4 Jewish sacred days or feasts. And again, Jesus uses the images related to the feasts to make claims about himself.
So these 4 stories down here have to do with Jewish feasts. And so we see clusters of stories having to do with Jewish institutions, clusters of stories having to do with Jewish feasts. And when we understand that these stories are clustered based on this kind of a theme, we know that this isn't chronological. This is a devised literary structure to illustrate Jesus in the context of Jewish institutions and Jewish feasts.
Now, all these conflicts, they culminate in one last miraculous sign. Jesus hears that his dear friend Lazarus is sick, but his family lives near Jerusalem, which is now a death trap for Jesus. Now, Jesus could stay away and he would save his own life, but he loves Lazarus. So once he hears that Lazarus has died, he goes to raise him from the dead, and he calls him to life out of his tomb, knowing that it will cost him his own life.
So here is a clear indication of why the raising of Lazarus is so pivotal to John. He's giving his life in exchange for raising Lazarus. He knows that if he raises Lazarus, he's going to be sought out, arrested, and killed. And so he's going into this knowing that it's going to lead to his condemnation or his execution. And the symbolism is so immense, and the implication of that is so immense, that if this were indeed true, there is no excuse of why the synoptics should omit it.
And the news of this amazing sign, it spreads quickly, of course, and just as Jesus knew would happen, the Jerusalem leaders hear about it and begin conspiring to murder him.
So in John, the Jews conspire to murder Jesus on account of this miraculous sign, the spectacular miracle. There's so many elements of symbolism within this miracle that parallels Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And so, but we know that it's in John, it's the rationale for why Jesus was condemned. In the synoptics, it's the cleansing of the temple, which was the catalyst for the conspiracy to kill Jesus, arrest and kill Jesus. So we see completely different presentations of what's the pivotal story, what's the pivotal event and circumstances that led to the crucifixion.
Now, all these conflicts, they culminate in one last miraculous sign. Jesus hears that his dear friend Lazarus is sick, but his family lives near Jerusalem, which is now a death trap for Jesus. Now, Jesus could stay away and he would save his own life, but he loves Lazarus. So once he hears that Lazarus has died, he goes to raise him from the dead, and he calls him to life out of his tomb, knowing that it will cost him his own life. And the news of this amazing sign, it spreads quickly, of course, and just as Jesus knew would happen, the Jerusalem leaders hear about it and begin conspiring to murder him. And so once the plot to murder Jesus is set in motion, we come into the book's second half. The first part focuses entirely on Jesus' final night and last words to the disciple.
So first half, intermission, the transitional event, Jesus' greatest sign that leads to his arrest and crucifixion, the glue between the first half and the second half being the raising of Lazarus. And then you have 4 chapters of Jesus giving one long speech. It's all red letters pretty much.
Now from here, Jesus goes into a long flowing speech that's concluded with a prayer. And you'll find the whole thing is unified by a few repeated themes. But it leads us into the final section of the book where John shows us what victory looks like Jesus style. The Jewish leaders send soldiers to Jesus and his disciples to arrest him. And when the soldiers ask which one Jesus is, he declares, "I am," and they fall backward. Now this is brilliant on John's part. These
not in the synoptics. Again, putting details that are pretty spectacular into the narrative, which are not attested by the synoptics.
Words are the culmination of 2 sets of 7 instances where Jesus has used that very phrase. And it all highlights one of John's core claims about Jesus. The words "I am," or in Greek ego eimi, they're the Greek translation of the Hebrew personal covenant name of God that was revealed to Moses back in Exodus chapter 3. It was also repeated many times in Isaiah. And John has strategically placed 7 moments in his story where Jesus says, "I am," followed by some astounding claim. "I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world, the gate for the sheep, the good shepherd, the resurrection, the way, the truth, and the life, the true vine." And John's also designed 7 other stories that have key moments where Jesus says simply, "I am," echoing this divine name.
So here, no coincidence, the author is obsessed with the number 7. The author is obsessed with Jesus identifying himself and explaining "I am" with respect 7 times in a specific sense and then 7 times in a generic sense. And we see there's all these repeated 7s. Jesus is given 7 titles in the first chapter. There's 7 signs. There's 7 plus 7 I ams. There's 2 weeks of 7 days. So there's lots of 7s integrated, interwoven into the narrative.
And so here, this occurrence as Jesus is arrested, it's the ironic climax of all of them, because Jesus reveals his divine name and power and victory precisely at the moment that he gives up his life. After this, Jesus' body is placed in a tomb that is then sealed. And on the first day of the week, Mary and then later the other disciples discover that the tomb is strangely open and then empty. And then Mary, all of a sudden, she meets Jesus. He's alive from the dead. Now, the resurrection of Jesus connects back to another pattern of sevens in John's gospel. So all the way back at the wedding party in Cana, when Jesus turned the water into wine, John told us that that was Jesus' first sign. And he also identified the second sign, the healing of the sick boy in chapter 4. But after this, John just lets you keep count. And if you have, you'll have noticed that the sixth sign was the raising of Lazarus from the tomb, which Jesus performed at the cost of his own life. And so that, and all of the signs, they point forward to this seventh and greatest sign at the culmination of the story, Jesus.
Again, 7 plus 7 plus 7. Groups of sevens, clusters of sevens, and fours.
His own resurrection from the dead. And that's what the Gospel of John is all about.
So this is the introductory animated video. And now I'm going to go into the longer video, which Tim Mackie gives a presentation and goes into more detail and gets deeper and deeper into what's going on with John. Let me just, before I do that, these are the evidences of John being a devised literary work. Chapter 1 introduces concepts that are woven into the narrative throughout the gospel. There is deep parallelism incorporated into the prologue in every scene with Old Testament scripture. There's the theme of misunderstanding that reoccurs 18 times. There's 7 titles given to Jesus in the first chapter. The Book of Signs has 4 groups of Jewish institutions and 4 groups of Jewish feasts. There's 7 plus 7 I am statements omitted in the Gospels, the Synoptics. There's 7 signs, just 7 signs, which have deep symbolic symbolism. The signs have symbolic parallels to Hebrew scriptures. The signs point to the passion resurrection. There's 2 groups of 7 days. There's 7 days leading up to the start of the signs, and then there's 7 days that lead up to the passion. The raising of Lazarus is of central importance in the Gospel of John as a precursor to Jesus being crucified and being resurrected. And various motifs throughout the Gospel reoccur over and over again.
Man, the way this thing's designed is really beautiful. And I'm going to just show you, it's just a couple things that John is doing. And once you realize his techniques for showing you when he's closing a section or opening a new section, you see it. It's such a great set of tools that he has. And so John has designed this thing to unfold in a series of movements of an opening, a key transition with Lazarus, and then a epilogue, a conclusion and an epilogue. And then within those 3 pillars are 2 large sections, and he's created little bookends, all of them, to help you know how to. So it's like a really well-structured play, like going to a multi-act play. In the beginning and endings of each section are really clear. So Jesus talks for longer periods of time and has longer conversations with people in John than he does in any of the other 3. You guys know what I'm talking about. And in John, Jesus will show up, in a city and then sit down and he's hungry and a woman shows up and then there's this long, it's like 2-page conversation, sprawling. And then the neighbors get involved and then it's a long conversation. Are you guys with me? That's the difference here. So that's a difference in narrative technique. John is trying to engage you with Jesus in a way that's different. It's not rapid fire. So John has taken, instead of trying to give you as many stories about Jesus as he can, he's taken just a handful, as we're going to see, literally just a handful, like a dozen. And he's given them extended development, more than they get in Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
So we see already he's presenting John. It's a play. It's well orchestrated. It's crafted. It's engineered. It's a literary masterpiece. There's nothing coincidental. It's all designed to interlink with itself. It's quite the work.
In the same way, John has also uncluttered his narrative form. John is the master of the carefully framed, luminous image that shines brilliantly against a dark canvas and lingers in your imagination. John's narrative technique is analogous to the visual artistry of Rembrandt's portraits. He's not attempting to compile the maximum number of Old Testament allusions. Rather, he prefers to focus on singular, artistically selected instances that repay sustained meditation. And he relies
artistically selected instances. Did you get that? Artistically selected instances.
Heavily on evoking images and figures from Israel's scripture. And so what John wants you to do is not gain the maximum amount of information about Jesus. What he wants you to do is sit with these handful of carefully crafted portraits.
Carefully crafted portraits.
Of Jesus at a wedding. Of Jesus storming the temple. Of Jesus in a dark room with a rabbi. Of Jesus with a Samaritan woman by a well. Of Jesus going to Jerusalem during the Sabbath and during Passover and during Tabernacles and during Hanukkah. Jesus raising Lazarus. Jesus in the upper room. Jesus before the powers. It's just are you with me? It's just like a dozen portraits. But each one is a universe unto itself, like a Rembrandt. And the longer you stare at each one
a Rembrandt that's crafted.
of these individual scenes, it's like, whoa, it's like the Matrix.
It's like the Matrix. It's like the Matrix, okay? So if you're saying, I'm the one who's saying it's like the Matrix, and that's my view. No, here's a mainline apologetic apologist who says John is like the Matrix.
You're just like, whoa, it's so masterful how he did that. That's one thing. And then the other thing that I want to spend the rest of the time talking about is the way John has built the narrative is that with the introduction, he's given you almost every single key word or idea that he's going to riff off of in the rest of the book. But he gives it to you in seed form or just a little hint form. Jesus is called in chapter 1 all of the names or titles that he will be called in the rest of the book, for example. And
so, yeah, the motive of introducing these titles and putting these titles on the names of John the Baptist and others is as a means of introduction, not a means. Obviously, the motive is to introduce Jesus, and the most effective way to do that is to put these titles on the mouth of various witnesses. Whereas with some of these, the Synoptics, John the Baptist was still asking whether Jesus was the one later into his ministry. And Peter didn't recognize Jesus as the Messiah until later on in the ministry. And so it doesn't fit with the historical Jesus and the sequence of events for these titles to be given up front.
And these people have no clue what they're saying about Jesus. Like at the beginning, but then as you realize, like the reason it's there is for you, the reader, to begin to watch these characters.
So the reason there, it's not because it's historical, it's for you, the reader, in other words.
Discover who Jesus is, because the whole package deal was given to you in the first chapter. So it's the way John's designed this, it's very different than Matthew, Mark, or Luke. And he's intentionally designed the story to not give up its secrets to you on the first reading.
So it's a Gnostic type thing where it's like, you need to dig in, but you need to do detective work. You need to solve the riddle. You need to decode it to understand all the secrets, to understand what's really being said and really being conveyed.
Like you won't, and this is what's brilliant about the Gospel of John, is can you get the basic idea by reading it the first time with somebody who's never read the Bible? That's level one. That's level one. And then what John has done is every time that you reread it now, you're going to begin to notice more repeated ideas and themes. It's like Easter eggs. He's planted Easter eggs perpetually throughout the whole thing. And then all of a sudden you'll notice that there's a scene that happens here in the water, in the baptism of Jesus. And then you'll notice maybe on your 14th read through that water keeps coming up. Yeah? Water. Whether it's water turned into wine, or water at a well, or drinking Jesus. You drink Jesus, right? In these stories here, and then he's the water of life, and then right? And then water. All of a sudden water's everywhere. And then there's water gushing out of his gut as he hangs on the cross.
Yeah, so that's one example of a theme, a motif repeating over and over and integrated into all these stories. It's designed into it to reinforce the theme of water. Obviously, it's engineered into the narrative because we don't see anything like that in the synoptics.
You're just like, what's happening? That's level 14, right? There's the water, spirit, blood thing going on. That's a whole red thread going through on. There's the belief theme and the testimony theme and the Trinity theme and the community of love that is the Trinity inviting you into the eternal community of love and life in the Trinity.
So because there's so many themes, they're reading the Trinity as a theme, and because there's all these motifs and all these cryptic sort of themes, that it leads to confusion. It leads to confusion about the ontology of God being conflated with Jesus being one with God by predication. And so these cryptic or allegorical, symbolic themes that the authors approach obviously is the source of error and of misguided understanding about God for centuries. And so because it's like this mystery novel that we need to unpack the riddle, it's the cause of confusion and misunderstanding.
The I and them and you and me and they and the Father and right? There's that whole thing. That's level 33, that runs through it. And he's made the thing so that you have to read it for the rest of your life to fully get what's going on here.
He's made it so you basically have to read it for the rest of your life to know what's going on. It doesn't reveal its secrets on the surface. And this is just kind of the Gnostic type thing where you just continue to speculate and to kind of get the parallels of meaning and extract deeper and deeper layers of meaning throughout your life by having all these hyperlinks and interwoven references and hints within it. And so you're not really, what you're seeing on the surface is not really what it's saying or what it's conveying. There's so many layers that you don't see beneath the surface. And because there's all these layers, people read it and they get different, they have different conclusions on what it's saying.
Here's a wonderful thing about the Gospel of John, is that he tells you, let's just say you're reading it for the first time, he tells you at the end of the book what he's just done to you. As you're reading through the book, you realize he's really messing with you.
He's really messing with you. You don't know what you're reading until you're aware of the multi layers of parallelism, the interwoven themes and motifs, the symbolism. You're not just reading a story, you're reading more than a story, the way the authors crafted it.
And by the end of the book, he actually tells you, okay, here's what I'm doing to you, here's why, and here's what I'm trying to get across here. So, is John a dispassionate, objective, journalistic account of the life of Jesus? Explicitly no.
It's not a journalistic historical histography account. Explicitly, no. That's not what it is. It's a different type of book. It's a different genre book. It fits more in line, as Dustin Smith noted, with Hellenistic revelation literature than it does as a histography of the life of the historical Jesus.
He's chosen carefully the events, and he's told them precisely in a certain way to highlight key themes.
He's chosen specific events and crafted them in a particular way to highlight key themes.
To mess with your mind.
To mess with your mind. Okay.
The person whose the narrator's voice that we've been hearing throughout the whole account. It's someone called the disciple Jesus loved. Is the voice, the name given to the narrator.
It's not through the whole account. It's through the last few chapters.
In the book. It's not, in other words, church early tradition that I think is faithful goes back to this comes from someone in the apostolic circle named John, and whether that's a John of Jerusalem or John the Elder, or whether that's John of Zebedee, or whether those two Johns are the same thing, people have been debating that for 2,000 years.
So here's an acknowledgement that it's not a clear cut. It's the Apostle John. There's speculation that it could be one of two or three Johns. And there's others that believe it's not John, it's some other author, or it's a group of authors. It's like a school of thought, theological school that is associated with a particular region. And so it's not a clear-cut apostolic authorship of the book. There is source material. There are scenes, like in the latter few chapters, of an eyewitness account. But that eyewitness account is specific to the context of the passion of Jesus being crucified and the resurrection. And so that's not attributed necessarily to the entire book. It's to those specific scenes of seeing the crucifixion and the resurrection in reference to the disciple who Jesus loved.
But it's somebody named John who was in the apostolic circle. But what's interesting is that in the book itself, it never identifies the narrator as John. It identifies the narrator as the disciple Jesus loved.
So yeah, this is a point. If it were meant to be identified, the disciple or apostle John, it would have identified him. And so the author is anonymous. He's not identified, and so we shouldn't we should understand that that's a key issue, because it disqualifies John, but because some people claim that because it's written by the Apostle John, therefore it's 100% factual historically, and it's accurate, it's historically reliable. And so that's an argument that I don't think is usable, because most likely this is written by a different John, or a school of a theological school that somehow maintains a tradition associated with one of the Johns.
Long debates about the we, but what it at least tells us is that the Gospel of John comes from one of these early apostolic figures who wrote this in the context of a community.
So, yeah, at the end of John chapter 21, we know his testimony is true. So it refers to a disciple that Jesus loved bearing witness to the resurrection. And then it says, and we know his testimony is true. So obviously the authorship is distinct from that disciple that Jesus loved. It's the author's attesting that we know his testimony is true. And so that itself is an indication that it's not the author who composed the majority of the book is a different person or entity or group of people than the actual disciple that Jesus loved, whose his testimony is being incorporated in the last chapters. So the book, it by and large is a product of a later believer, but it incorporates some elements of an eyewitness account, at least with respect to the crucifixion and resurrection. but not necessarily, not in the whole book, just the last few chapters of the book.
And it's to a community that he shared and wrote this account. And the story is told so that to really comprehend anything Jesus says or does in the story, it's always pointing forward to the moment of the crucifixion and the resurrection. Does that make sense? So no, he just told you a story about Jesus storming the temple, but he tells you in the story, you're not really going to understand the significance of this until you get to this part of the story. And then you're going to have
another thing that's not mentioned in the synoptics.
to reread it and then come back again, and then you'll see this whole temple body thing and why I'm telling the story the way that I'm telling it. So what an interesting way to tell a story. Is he's telling us that this moment of the narrative, Jesus dying on the cross and Jesus walking out of the empty tomb, that everything in the story is pointing forward to these two events. And actually, these two events retrospectively illuminate and make sense of everything Jesus is saying and doing in these stories. He's made
another layer of interdependency and interwoven. The front looks forward and the back looks in retrospect, and so you really can't isolate parts of the story without taking it as a piece of the whole. Again, this is an indication that it's an engineered literary masterpiece that's been carefully crafted.
Them intentionally puzzling so that you only find out what this means until you get to this point. So he does this so many times in the book. It's clearly like a principle. This is from my other favorite Gospel of John scholar, who's yet to write a commentary. Do you guys know about Richard Balcom? Holy cow, this human being. So he's a professor. So this is a really helpful quote in a wonderful essay, but a helpful quote. He says, "The Gospel of John is a text that constantly creates the impression that more is going on than immediately meets the eye." Right? So people come up to Jesus after he just fed them, and they'll say, "Where did you get this bread?" And he'll say something like, He'll just say some weird off-the-wall thing. He's like, "If you don't do the works of my Father, you will not see eternal life." And you're like, what? How is that an answer to their question, right? You know what I'm talking about? It's just Jesus is puzzling in this book. He never answers anybody in a straightforward way, and he always responds to people in a way that invites these long conversations that never go the way a normal conversation should go, but he's leading them down a path. He's like this wise sage riddler.
Okay, so yeah, things go in an inorganic way in terms of the dialogue and the extended conversation. Just basically makes the analogy of a wise sage riddler. So when people say it's a spiritual gospel, it's a way of saying it's a non-literal gospel. Everything has a symbolic or metaphorical meaning to it. It's not to be taken. It's to be more taken as more symbolism than it is narration or history.
He's the ultimate. He's the book of Proverbs embodied in a human, really. And so that's Jesus in the story, but then the story itself is that way. If you've read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus storming the temple is the thing that put the target on his back.
So critical difference. In the Synoptics, it's the storming of the temple that puts the target on his back. In John, it's early. It's near the very beginning of the ministry, and it's the raising of Lazarus that puts the target on his back. So there's two very incompatible explanations of what put the target on his back. What's the principal event that led to his arrest and crucifixion?
It's Passover week. But John's taken that story and put it right all the way up at the beginnings. Like, why did he do that? He must have a really important reason for dislocating that story from its chronological location.
Dislocated from its chronological location, that's key, because it fits with the framework and architecture of how John has engineered and framed the gospel. It's more advantageous from the point of putting together the 4 Jewish institutions where he's cleansing the temple in that context of 4 Jewish institutions. And it's really more central to make this story of Lazarus the glue which connects the signs together with the Book of Glory as the pivotal story that leads to his death.
Why does Jesus keep going to Jerusalem for all of these feasts here, for during the Sabbath and during Passover and Tabernacles and Hanukkah? There must be more going on here. Why he stacked all the feasts together like this?
He stacked all the feasts together. Obviously, he stacked the feasts together. It's not chronological. It's a symbolic way of addressing Jesus in the context of these feasts and Jewish institutions.
Kind of thing. The author deploys the power of metaphor and symbol in a masterful way so that the stories and teachings of Jesus are constantly and mutually illuminated by referring to other texts within the book. So, for example, John comes onto the scene, John the Baptist, and he talks about himself as a witness. Like the words repeated like 10 times in the story here. Witness, I testify, I'm a witness. So testimony language. And then all of a sudden, as you start reading through, you realize there's this whole testimony witness motif by the mouth of 2 witnesses. Yeah, that key passage in Deuteronomy. And then all of a sudden you realize John has arrayed this whole thing like a court case. And he's constantly putting different witnesses on the stand before you. Sometimes it's John, sometimes it's Jesus himself, sometimes it's the voice of the Father, sometimes it's other characters who testify about Jesus, sometimes it's the miracles Jesus.
So this motif of witness is so critical to John. You have John the Baptist bearing witness in a much more explicit and a way than you do in the Synoptics. You have Jesus bearing witness about himself over and over again. Practically with respect to every sign, every miracle, Jesus is making some statement about who he is. You have the 7 I am statements. You have the 7 specific I am statements, the 7 generic I am statements. It's stacked. It's the idea is to maximize in every case a witness and to put in the most concentrated way possible witness after witness after witness to make a case that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, the Christ, the Son of God. So it's to symbolically present Jesus and who he is, but it's more symbolic than it is historic. And because obviously the goal of John is to cluster these stories and to integrate them and interweave them in such a way that it really hits the theme home, hits it home in terms of all the witnesses that are in the story.
Jesus performs, and so you can just trace through the witness theme, and all of a sudden it's sort of like if you have special like 3D glasses, you put on your witness testimony glasses and you look at John, and then like he's made them so as you read through your 48th time and you're just looking at that repeated word, you're going to notice it's like this complex tapestry. That's what Balcom's talking about here. Each story has been coordinated with other parts of the narrative so that
each story is coordinated with other parts of the narrative.
Stories acquire more layers of meaning than the surface one. John's a master of irony, so that characters constantly say more than they intend, and sometimes even the opposite of what they mean. Jesus is constantly misunderstood, foregrounding the question of the true meaning of his words. How many conversations go off the tracks from the other people's perspective, right? It's just conversations never go in a straightforward way, and Jesus is always saying these half riddles. And people are like, what? What do you mean? Eat your body? What do you mean, Jesus? Drink water from your belly? What do you mean?
Yeah, so again, he introduces the theme of misunderstanding. I'm going to play a short video from, it's just a 2.5 minute clip of Dustin Smith himself attesting to the theme of misunderstanding.
This week's episode will explore the literary theme of misunderstanding in the Gospel of John. Now, recognizing and understanding this theme is highly important for making sense of what the author or authors, if that's what it turns out to be, of the Gospel of John are trying to convey to their ideal readers. So Warren Carter, in his book, John, Storyteller, Interpreter, Evangelist, Warren Carter defines the theme of misunderstanding in these 3 steps. Step number 1, Jesus makes an ambiguous statement in the narrative of the Gospel of John. Step number 2, the conversation partner misunderstands what Jesus says, either by interpreting it literally or by asking an inappropriate question. Step number 3, either Jesus or the narrating author explains the statement, although sometimes an explanation is missing, but it's clearly implied. Now, Warren Carter argues that this particular theme appears 18 times in the Gospel of John. In Warren Carter's book, he actually draws attention to the earlier work by R. Allen Culpeper. And the name of that book is Anatomy of the Fourth Gospel, a Study in Literary Design. So, of course, if we're looking at the theme of misunderstanding, which is interwoven into the narrative of the Gospel of John at least 18 times, then certainly a book on the literary design of the Fourth Gospel would be very important. Rudolf Bultmann argued in his commentary on the Gospel of John that, quote, the device of the misunderstanding occurs again and again throughout the Gospel, end quote. And Bultmann actually suggests that this particular device, what I call the theme of misunderstanding, was already being used in Hellenistic revelation literature, which would suggest, if this is true, that this particular literary theme is not unique to the Gospel of John. It might have been very familiar to those who were more widely read in Hellenistic revelation literature. The misunderstanding has been widely accepted as non-controversial and clearly apparent by scholars of the Gospel of John for over 100 years.
There you have it. Yeah, the theme of misunderstanding interwoven. Obviously, that points to it being a literary masterpiece. You know, it's a contrived work. It's narrated such to incorporate this motif, and it fits more in line with Hellenistic revelation literature, which is something that the Gnostics would have liked. You know, in terms of the genre of literature that they're really attracted to. So that's Dustin Smith just affirming the wide, the commonly understood theme of misunderstanding. And what we see Jesus is portrayed as being confusing and speaking over people's heads deliberately in the reference of dialogue, where in the synoptics, the style and the way Jesus speaks is totally different. His approach to speaking, the length at which he speaks and engages in dialogue is completely different.
The gospel is also shot through with intertextual connections to the Hebrew Bible that expand the meaning of any given story when you notice them and ponder them. The book was written not only to make sense to first-time readers, but it was designed to be studied. in order to yield its full cornucopia of meaning to only the most attentive of students. Its frequently riddling character is meant to tease the intelligence and entice the readers into its multi-dimensional world of meaning. For example, there's a story in John chapter 9 where Jesus heals the eyes of a man born blind and he's able to see. Yeah? Famous story. Now, by the time you get to chapter 9, however, is that, so that's in this, it's in the Feast of Tabernacles complex here. So by the time you get to here, however, you have been trained, if you're an attentive reader, you've been trained to the meaning of blindness and sight, and how seeing Jesus is equated with believing in him. So being able to truly see him is an image in multiple stories of trusting and believing in him. And so all of a sudden, the surface level meaning of a guy's eyes being healed so that he can see and see Jesus at the culmination of the story, that all of a sudden, if you have your blindness sight glasses on, and then you look at John, it's like all kinds of things start lighting up here. So another image, it's just an image, but related to blindness and sight, is light and darkness. Because can you see if you're in the dark? No. What do you need to see if you're in the dark? You need light. Does Jesus ever talk about that very thing? He does. So all of a sudden, we're up all the way to the opening paragraph where Jesus is the light shining in the darkness. He's already been preparing you for this motif from the first sentences of the book. So Jesus is a light shining in the darkness. Then there's going to be all of these different stories about whether or not people are able to truly see. And seeing is equating with believing in multiple texts. And so if you don't believe in Jesus, you can't see the light, even if it's standing right in front of you, which means that you're walking in darkness, which is the equivalent of acting in unbelief. And wouldn't you know it, all the stories of unbelieving people in the Gospel of John take place at night.
All the stories of unbelieving people take place at night. So there's just so many things. It's not like the details in terms of the time of day. You'll see later on the place, locations. Nothing is coincidental. Everything has a double meaning, a symbolic meaning. It's not necessarily the meaning you see on the surface. There's deeper layers to it that are crafted into the narrative that you have to unpack the riddle to discover.
Are you with me? You're just like, oh my gosh, how long did it take to write this thing? You know, like, are you? Yeah, and unfolding.
How long did it take to write this thing? It's a literary masterpiece. It's such a brilliant piece of revelation literature. It's definitely symbolic and spiritualized. And as Origen said in the 3rd century, it's some things are more symbolic than they are historical.
Inspiration of the Spirit, that's fine. But dude, this took this guy a long time because every word of this book is keyed into these elaborate interconnections of meaning. And then just remember, by the way, that introduction to light and darkness in the first sentences of the book is just riffing off of the first sentences of the Bible from the book of Genesis, which means that John is attuned to really important Hebrew scriptures that have the key words light and dark, blindness and sight. Particularly Genesis 1 and Isaiah chapter 6 and Isaiah 53 have blindness, sight, light, dark stuff going on. And so you're constantly going to find in the matrix of light, dark, blindness, sight stuff going on, you're going to find little phrases. It's like a detective story, right? You're constantly assuming there's more going on here.
Again, it's a matrix of interwoven themes and motifs pointing back to Hebrew scriptures, but also the book cross-referencing itself, and really multiple layers of meaning and hidden, concealed sort of conflations and subtle hints that you really have to, like a detective, unpack and put the clues together to come up with a more holistic understanding and interpretation of what it is. The problem is fundamentalists, they take the surface level statements of what Jesus says, in terms of traditionists and Trinitarians, or even people in other theological camps like modalists. Jesus says, I and the Father are one, or he says, if you see me, you see the Father. But before Abraham was, I am, or unless you believe that I am, you will die in your sins. Well, these are all surface level statements that Jesus is making. You can't take an isolated verse without its context, without unpacking these layers of interrelationship, the interconnections between them, and then understand the true meaning of what he's trying to convey, as opposed to taking a literal surface layer meaning of what he's saying.
Here's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the Gospel of John is written to tell stories that are intentionally symbolic.
Oh, there's the key right there. It's written to tell stories that are intentionally symbolic. It's written to tell stories that are intentionally symbolic. That's basically sums it up in just a few words.
There's a literal surface level meaning to the story, but he's intentionally made it so that that's just stage one. And the whole point is that you get to stage 83 or whatever.
83.
And so he wants you to begin thinking about a story about people eating bread, or a story about sitting by a well, or a story of sitting by some steps where a guy gets into a pool to get healed. Right? All of these literal things in the story, in a Rembrandt portrait, they take on the symbolic luminescence. And then they connect to all of these other similar symbols throughout the story. And you realize I'm supposed to look at the whole presentation.
Supposed to look at it whole and understand every nuance and detail and subtle innuendo, every hint. And if you don't, you're going to be misguided. That's the danger with the Gospel of John. You have to really dig deep and understand the context, the cross-references, both from the Hebrew Bible and within itself, to really get it right. And the thing is, so many people fail to do that. And there's just, the hazard is you miss one little interconnection, and you take a different meaning between an inference or a conflation that, like, for instance, when it conflates Jesus with God, well, Trinitarians see that as an ontological statement. When Thomas says, my Lord and my God, they see that as an ontological statement. When it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, that they see that the third phrase as an ontological statement. And so there's just so many hazards and mishaps in terms of connecting all the clues together in a way that actually portrays the truth, that it leads itself to, it leads people who think that they know what John is saying, who are convinced they know what John is saying, into error and a misguided understanding of theological implications, that are Christological. And so that's why John is the source of so much confusion and so much contention throughout the centuries.
Here, I'm just trying to pass on a set of tools that has made the Gospel of John so exciting to read, because every one of these complexes, matrices of light and darkness, or testimony, or water, or blood, and so on. Every single one is just another facet. So the Gospel of John, man, holy cow. Can you see now why I don't feel like, who can do justice to what a masterpiece this is? But
he said matrix, it's a masterpiece. It's a masterpiece. It's highly engineered, highly crafted, anyways, clearly it's symbolic. It's meant to convey deep meaning in the way that the narratives and the pictures are crafted.
I'm doing my best. So what essentially I want to do for the sessions that remain is begin working through sections of the book. And sometimes what we'll do is we'll just be reading in a section, hit on a word, and then I'll just show you the matrix, how it works through the rest of the book.
The matrix.
You You would think that the opening paragraph would be like the most clear thing. Yeah? And in this case, the opening paragraph is like a riddle.
Clearly, the prologue of John is a riddle. And if it's a riddle, people are going to come up with different solutions to the riddle. And even in the Unitarian community, there's several different interpretations of the prologue. And everyone's arguing about their interpretation being the correct one. And so if our salvation is based on having a correct interpretation of John, which is, basically interpreting the dialogues accurately and the prologue accurately, then that's a pretty harsh requirement for us to be saved, because it leads to so much confusion and there's so many different opinions on small points of interpretation. So again, that's what we see in the prologue.
And it's a riddle that will repay meditation as you read through the rest of the book now. And then come back to the opening lines, and then you'll be like, oh, so good. We did that. I just wanted to give you an example of the Rembrandt portrait. I want to now move out and just show you a couple anchors for how he's designed the book to work as a whole. I just want to point out one little comment here. This is in chapter 1. John tells us where John the Baptist was baptizing. Chapter 1, verse 28. He tells us a story about John, and then he just says, oh, hey, sorry, you guys should know, this was all happening in a place called Bethany. And then he just moves on. You're like, okay, it's interesting. And he just tells you right here, Bethany. And actually, this is Richard Balcom has a whole essay on this. This has puzzled people for many generations of scholars, because up in the Jordan, in that northern part of the Jordan, there's no record of any town named Bethany proper.
So there's a Bethany inserted into the story where there's no record of a Bethany. And we're going to see there's a literary reason for that. It's a device. It's not meant to designate an actual location. It's meant to be a marker within the story.
But there is a little region that in Aramaic was called Betaniah. Betaniah. But John has spelled it with the name Bethany. Why did he do that? Well, is Bethany as a name?
So he misspelled the wrong a place in Aramaic, Bethany, for a specific literary purpose, not because it's the actual name of the place.
Of a place going to appear in any other moments in the story. Yes, indeed. In fact, it's precisely at the middle transition story, which takes place in the town of Bethany, the actual town of Bethany that's outside of Jerusalem. So Richard Baucham's observation, and it's been accepted in commentaries after he made the point, is that he's actually intentionally misspelled the name of this place to match the name of this place to create a literary borderline in the narrative. Are you with?
So he's using it, as he just said, as a literary borderline. It's basically to frame the book of signs in terms of these two sets of 4 stories, to mark the beginning and the end of that portion of that section within the template, the framework of the overall gospel. Now you might say, well, that's kind of a long shot, but you'll see it's not just in this instance, that there's other instances with the same technique is being used as a literary device.
Me? So this sounds enough like the name of the actual place that readers would be like, oh, that's good. The two Bethanys. The two Bethanys. And here it's John the Baptist's testimony that points people to Jesus. Here it's the miracle that Jesus performs that testifies. It's the final act of testimony in the narrative that points to who Jesus is. Here it gets people to follow him. Here Jesus' testimony sets in motion the machine that's going to kill him. Because the healing of Lazarus is the thing that puts the target on his back in John's narrative, because the Pharisees want to kill him. So the two Bethanies.
So you see the parallelism. Again, the Lazarus story is so pivotal and instrumental to the book of John. Completely not in the synoptics, but there's multiple layers of connection, interconnectivity between the Lazarus story and John the Baptist testifying, and the Lazarus story and the crucifixion of Jesus. And so many details in terms of the story, which goes beyond an entire chapter, that is heavily symbolic and meaningful as it's been crafted and integrated into the full context of the story.
So what that tells us is when John tells us information about where events take place, that's important. It's going to function as some kind of marker in the narrative.
So physical locations in the narrative function as literary markers. They're not meant to convey literal physical locations. They're meant to be markers, literary markers.
And the next narrative is about a wedding that takes place where? Cana. So the opening narrative takes place at Cana. And here John's going to tell us 4 stories that follow here, actually 5 stories, in 4 blocks though, of Jesus, something happening with Jesus, where Jesus is going to do or say something in the presence or in association with some like classic Jewish institution or cultural symbol. So here it's a Jewish wedding. It's really ancient. But the whole thing about the wine and the wedding, what follows from that, it's a story about a temple. Doesn't get any more classic Jewish symbol than that. Then Jesus has a nighttime conversation with a rabbi, right? Then Jesus goes to a sacred well that's connected with Jacob as he talks with the Samaritan woman here, the estranged brothers or kinsmen of the Israelites. So every one of these stories is Jesus walking into a loaded Jewish cultural situation. It begins with one at Cana. And then at the end of 4, there's the story of Jesus healing the son of the centurion. There's after the Samaritans believe, Jesus came to Galilee after being in Samaria. And where does he go? At the end of chapter 4. He goes to exactly the same place that he started, all the way back in chapter 2, to Cana. And then this is where the centurion comes to meet him. Just little clues here. This section begins in Cana, and it ends in Cana.
So a section here of 4 blocks of 4 Jewish institutions starts in Cana and ends in Cana as a means to frame these 4 blocks. So we have a frame of Bethany with Bethany for the Book of Signs, and we have a frame for Cana and Cana for the 4 blocks that have to do with Jewish religious institutions.
After this, there was a feast of the Jews. This is going to be a Sabbath. And Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, he was in Jerusalem, and, there is in the city this by the sheep gate, there's a pool. In Hebrew, they call it Bethesda. And it has 5 porticos, or some of your translations might have colonnades. It's like of an open air atrium with steps leading up to it with pillars. Yeah? It's one of these kind of Greek, Roman style buildings. So, okay, that's interesting. Like, why am I being told this information? But places matter here. So the scene is all about this colonnade. I'm going to just call it the port for short. That's the portico. This is the opening scene right here. Then you're going to get 4 stories. So he's in Jerusalem for Hanukkah, and it was winter, and he was walking around the temple. Oh yeah, what exact part of the temple? By that place with the stairs and the pillars and the open porch, the portico, right? Do you get it? Yeah, you get it. Yeah. So it's the same principle. He's used, just like Cana frames this section of 4 stories. Now the porch, the portico, becomes the frame for this section of four feasts.
So again, location is used as a literary device to frame particular sections in the overall book, as opposed to designate actual locations. It's a literary method that's if you were to just read through John and read it literally, you'd say, oh, these locations are actual locations. Well, in some cases they might be, but there's a bit of engineering and changing the name, altering things to be a cryptic method of showing blocks of stories, to framing things to where there's certain themes and certain parts of the book that are interrelated with each other apart from the book as a whole. And so these 4 blocks are framed with locational marks, and then the Book of Signs at large is framed with Bethany at the beginning and Bethany at the end. So there's a scholar who claims that these locations are actually locations, and this is evidence of it being historically accurate. And Lydia McGrew is someone who believes John is historically accurate. But what we see, let me go back to my presentation here. For instance, with the 4 Jewish feasts, the beginning of this subsection of the book begins with the portico and ends with the portico. McGrew, in her book, she defends the historicity on the Gospel of John. I'm going to show a few clips of her, but she's an analytical philosopher, homemaker, homeschool mom, and author. She believes that these locational references just prove, because John is being more detailed, that it's actually more historic. So the fallacy of her line of reasoning is that the more detail that John provides, the more evidence of it that it's historic. And she conflates precision with accuracy. Just because John is more precise than the other Gospels, somehow it also must be more accurate. But that's a fallacy. Precision doesn't mean accuracy. It just means providing more detail. It's only accurate if those details are true.
Which Gospel is the most historically reliable?
Oh dear. Yeah, I would not want to have a competition there. So I think they're all really.
So this is a dead giveaway. She doesn't want to have a competition. That's a blue-pilled thing where it's basically said, I don't want to believe that one is better than the others historically. But let me come up with my misguided notions about why John provides us more fresh information.
Really, highly historically reliable. I think maybe the way I'll take that question instead is to talk about which one gives us the most fresh information, so then that's going to be John, precisely because he's complementing the synoptics. There's some kind of dependence among the synoptics, and it's a whole complicated question. What is the nature of that dependence? But what that means is that you're not getting as much new information from each synoptic gospel as compared with the others, whereas John's giving us all of this additional stuff.
So she thinks because John gives us all this additional stuff that that proves that it's better, or that it's more historical because it's richer in terms of details provided, that there's something better about John. But that's a total fallacy. It's just because more details in the narrative doesn't mean that detail is historically accurate. There's no way she can validate the historicity of the information provided. When we saw that the author uses location as a literary landmark as opposed to a literal place, and again, accuracy doesn't mean precision. Just because John is more precise or more specific about certain things doesn't mean it's accurate. It just means that there's there's more details that are implemented within the narrative.
The other thing about John is that he's so interested in location. I have a section in one of my chapters that location, 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 like the realtor's slogan.
So she's talking about location, location, location. And we just saw that location, by and large, is a literary device to bookend certain sections of John as opposed to a literal place. And she's invoking location as some sort of evidence that John is more accurate. And it's completely misguided. And if you don't see that how John is structured, you're going to see location as being, the Gospels don't have these locations, the other ones. So therefore, because John has these locations, somehow he knows more, or the author knows more, and that's just a misnomer. The location is not what it appears to be. Location is location within the literary work of the fourth gospel, as opposed to an actual physical location.
That whenever John tells about where Jesus is, he doesn't just say like a certain village. That's a phrase you'll find in Luke, a certain village. And Luke didn't know what village it was, so he's not going to say if he doesn't know, But with John, it's Bethany, and he'll even tell you Bethany is 15 furlongs from Jerusalem, and Bethany turns out 15 furlongs from Jerusalem. And, it's not just in Jerusalem, it's by the sheep gate or Solomon's porch. So John has a love of precision and almost going into an unnecessary degree of precision.
There's no unnecessary. Nothing in John is a coincidence. So the precision provided by John, it's a marker. It's a clue. It's a clue that, as a detective, you need to unpack to understand why it's there. There's just nothing coincidental in the Gospel of John. And so he's not just trying to just remember and recollect and provide the most detail possible because it's a journalistic approach to providing things in their historical context. No, there's multiple layers of what's going on beneath the surface. And her invoking the portico or the Bethany as evidence of, because there's more precision, invoking that there's more accuracy is misguided. Precision doesn't mean accuracy. Just because there's more details shown doesn't mean those details are consistent with how things actually played out in real life.
Now, why am I spending so much time on this? One, this is a difficult paragraph because it's like Bible code language. Right? You have to be a Bible nerd to decode what these symbols mean.
So yeah, to understand John, you have to be a Bible nerd to decode what the symbols mean. It's cryptic, it's mysterious, it's spiritualized. There's multiple layers of meaning. It's interwoven themes and motifs. You need to be a Bible nerd. It's not like Luke and Acts where you don't have to be a Bible nerd. It's meant to clearly convey the gospel message as clearly as possible through the ministry of Christ and the ministry of the apostles. So where should we go for the first place to go for apostolic Christianity? Well, we should go to Luke and Acts where it's explicit, not a place where you need to be a Bible nerd to make sense of it, to make heads or tails out of it.
Do you see how rich? My whole point here is that this is rich. This is giving you all the tools that you need to understand the 8 Rembrandts that you're going to walk into. Every single one of these stories is going to be Jesus says or does something, people don't get it. And it either causes confusion or it causes conflict. And then that conflict is going to turn into conversations that become all of these ways that all of these thematic soccer balls and conversations are going to get kicked down the field. The way that these is this right here. Is this.
So he's introducing, this is the Matrix. All right, so if you're going to criticize me for using the Matrix theme on this broadcast, I'm just doing what I'm just following off of this cue that it is the Matrix. You have to decode it. You have to be a Bible nerd. It's not what it appears to be on the surface. You're gonna be misguided. If there's just so many ways that you can be misguided unless you're careful to decode it all properly. It's a big riddle, and so he's making the analogy with the Matrix, and that's why I'm using the analogy of the Matrix.
This is how these authors are so saturated in the Hebrew Bible. They think, they dream, they talk and they don't just talk. They talk in ways that it's all so closely connected for them. Are you with me? It's exactly what you're seeing here in this story. That's the last sentence of the prologue. And then just on to chapter 2. Here we go. Right? It's just this like a riddle. So
so he just sums up the whole prologue as a big riddle that just abruptly moves on to the story.
And then he moves on to these really well architected sections. So clearly that ends on a cliffhanger.
Yeah, and that's a key word, architected. He moves on to these architected Rembrandt portraits, crafted, engineered portraits that are architected to incorporate all these themes that get kicked down like little soccer balls down a soccer field.
He's just loaded your mind and heart with all these key words and images, and then the rest of it is the portraits that are just going to play it all out. This section right here, so I already walked you through how he's bookended. Remember? Cana, the portico. This is all feasts. This is all key cultural symbols. He's intentionally choosing events that took place at these places and times because John wants us to see a connection between the meaning of each one of these, and it illuminates some aspect of Jesus' character or his mission.
More symbolic than historical. The whole purpose of crafting these stories is to illuminate a symbolic truth as opposed to conveying a historical narrative.
So every one of these is handpicked and really intentional. And there's almost always a network of hyperlinks going back to Hebrew Bible texts for each one of these. In chapters 1 and 2, John has, this is all Richard Balcom, by the way. It's a chart on page 7. John has, if you've been paying attention and through chapters 1 and 2, he's very careful to mark the sequence of 7 days. In John 1 and 2, it starts here, and you just watch. He marks every single day in chapters 1 and 2. And then the moment you get to Bethany, the 7 days culminate in Bethany. And then the moment you hit this Bethany, this whole block takes place in how many days? Can you guess? 7. He architects this whole thing as 7 days.
So 2 architectures, one in chapters 1 and 2 of 7 days in reference to Bethany, and then another week of 7 days subsequent to the second Bethany. Clearly architecture contrived, engineered into the narrative. Another layer of 7. 7 titles, 7 signs, 7 plus 7 I am statements, 7 plus 7 days.
So 7 days leading up to the first sign, 7 days after the last sign, after the 6th sign, leading up to the 7th sign. So it's, what on earth? And then the summary is, hey, dear reader, here is the first sign that Jesus did. We did this in the John video. So look at all these countdowns he's starting. You've got the 7-day thing you're supposed to be keeping track with. That's like read through number 17. And read through 18, you got to keep track of the signs. Because he's going to start counting down the signs for you as well. This is going to be sign number 1. Anybody remember sign number 2? It's the healing of the centurion's son, which happens like down here in this little mini story packed in here. And he tells you this one, he says, this was the second sign. He just says it. So he's teaching you to count the miracles Jesus does. And then he stops counting. and he just tells you, he'll just say, here's another, oftentimes it'll be someone else calls something Jesus said a sign, but he's just going to plant them all the way through, leading up to the last sign in this section, which is the raising of Lazarus, and then silence on the signs until this. The empty tomb, the seventh sign, and you know it's a sign because all the way back here, Jesus said that his death and resurrection destroy the temple. What sign will you give us? Destroy this temple, and I'll raise it up again in 3 days.
Yeah, so to John, everything's a witness and a sign. You have the 7 signs up here on the right top corner. He starts the count, and then he lets you just keep track of the count after he indicates that there's the first sign, the second sign. There's a preview that he will rebuild this temple after you tear it down. That's the third sign, or that's the indication that the final resurrection is another sign, the last sign. And the major pivotal sign between the initial signs and the last sign of Jesus being raised from the dead is Lazarus being raised from the dead, and in a parallel sense with Christ being raised from the dead.
So here he already tells you that this is going to be the ultimate sign. So the sign, that's a whole thing you can follow through. And there's 7, of course there are. You know, it's 7 days, 7. So anyway, it's amazing.
The more
so
sevens,
temple,
the better.
Sheesh. Is this an iconic symbolic space? I mean, it's hard to imagine a more symbolic kind of space. And it's Passover, for goodness sakes. So Jesus storms in, and he does his thing. You know the story. But notice particularly if it's Passover, then this is all about a whole series of animals and that are going to be sacrificed. And what John highlights, especially, the money changers, but he also highlights the money changers are just facilitating the purchase of what? Of the animals, the sacrificial animals. Why are people traveling to Jerusalem for Passover? To sacrifice their animals for Passover. And so Jesus, he's interrupting the whole Passover. And even if it was only for a couple hours that he shut the system down, he shut the system down. It's like running into a meeting of Congress.
So he's saying that the significance of the cleansing of the temple is so significant that it's equivalent to shutting down Congress. Like it's the Passover, people are buying money for animals to sacrifice, and he's interrupting the whole machine. And in the Synoptics, this is the attributed to why he was arrested and why they conspired to arrest him and kill him. But in John, it's delegated to the second chapter, the early part of the book of signs, as opposed to the event that preceded his arrest. Whereas, but the significance of this is so big that it makes perfect sense that if he's interrupting business as usual in the temple, that he's a major disruption and problem that the Jews would conspire to get rid of. But this occurs early in John, so that it could be replaced in John with the raising of Lazarus as the instrument, the pivotal story.
Well, they're passing law and just like, none of this today, and even if you get ushered out in 20 minutes, takes 20 minutes, you shut down Congress. And it's a symbolic action. Are you guys with me here? So he's like the ultimate, in my opinion, people who are doing the kinds of things that Jesus was doing, he's like an activist. People who do these provocative public acts and then say puzzling riddles to point to the meaning of those acts. That's what Jesus is doing here. But it's this great irony. People trust in him. He doesn't trust humans. It's so good. Because he knows humans. In fact, he doesn't need anybody to testify about humans. Humans need someone to testify about him, but he doesn't need anybody to launch a case against humanity. The history, our history is that. He knew what's in humans. Now, there was one particular human. Do you get the sequence? One particular human, a Pharisee named Nicodemus, and he came at nighttime. It's the first nighttime event in the gospel. So it's such a great seamless transition there. And so in other words, John is setting you up to have what kind of posture towards Nicodemus? Do you see? Suspicion. Right? People believe in Jesus. Oh, yay, Jesus. He does signs and wonders. But Jesus doesn't believe in people, right? Because he knows what people are like. In fact, there was one people who came to see him that night, and then it goes on.
So here, again, it's John is setting the audience up, the reader up, to have a suspicion and to paint Nicodemus as sort of the one he doesn't trust, who appears to him at night, and it's a carefully crafted narrative in the sense that there's a setup, and it's to get you conditioned to receive Nicodemus with a certain disposition.
So that's John's way of stacking the deck of the narrative. And so Nicodemus, this is amazing. So this is Jesus talking with. It's as if he's having a conversation with the leadership of Israel of his day. That's what Nicodemus represents. He's the teacher.
So Nicodemus is a symbolic character that represents Israel of the day. And clearly it's a crafted narrative for Jesus to engage with a person that represents symbolically the institution of Israel of the day.
Teacher of Israel, you remember? That's what he calls him. And what's great is this conversation involves, it's the first really, really weird conversation where Jesus never says a straightforward response to what Nicodemus is saying. And there's lots of word plays and puns happening in the conversation.
Lots of word plays and puns. It's not a natural thing. It's obviously it's defies literary structure. To have multiple layers of meaning within the expressions and the dialogue.
But it's Jesus talking with the leadership of Israel in his day. That's what Nicodemus represents. So you have a conversation here between Jesus and Israel, corrupt Israel that needs to be reborn, just like the prophet said that they did. If Jesus is the source of the water, in a story about tabernacles where God provided water in the wilderness when the rock was struck. Are you guys tracking with me? Okay? Can I think of another story in the Gospel of John where the Messiah is struck so that water flows out of him? Are you tracking with me?
Here, a parallel between the water and the rock and Jesus being struck. Clear connection in a hyperlink, symbolic parallel between who Jesus is symbolically and him being struck, and water pouring out of him, which isn't attested in the Synoptics. Like if he was struck and gushed out water, why isn't that also recorded in the Synoptics? Well, the intent is to provide a literary parallel between the rock when the Jews came out of Egypt in the desert and Jesus being struck and water coming out of him. It's that's the parallel. It's not just, oh, by the way, he was struck and water came out of him. No, it's also, there's nothing coincidental about anything in John. It's all interwoven with other things and parallels other things.
You know exactly what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about. And it's odd because you have, right, Jesus here, and he's got this Roman soldier, right, who pierces his side with a lance, and we're told what flowed out of him. So water and blood. Now there's been a lot of explanations about this based on like medical science and stuff like that. And that's interesting. There's no way that's what John was thinking about.
Yeah, it's not what it seems to be. That's not the point. The point is to make Jesus a parallel with the rock that was struck in the desert.
You know what I'm saying? Like, water and blood. You guys, water and blood. It makes perfect sense. So cryptic riddle comments here are all illuminated in the moment of Jesus' death.
Cryptic riddle comments and one point are illuminated somewhere else, right? So if you just take those comments at face value, you're like, what does that mean? You're not going to know. You're not going to be able to cross-reference what anything means unless you look at the entire work as an integrated work.
And this happens on the little portico, which echoes this opening story, and then boom, we're into the transition story there. This whole thing is that Jesus intentionally allows someone he loves to die. And it breaks his heart, doesn't it? He weeps. He weeps over people's unbelief. He weeps over the reality of death for his friend. Jesus is a really complicated character in the story. So he delays arriving. That sets up the whole drama.
So now it's going into the Lazarus story. And in Lazarus, he's going to emphasize how there's so many parallels and so much symbolism in the Lazarus story, and how it's so interconnected with the rest of John. And pay very close attention, because the synoptics lack the Lazarus story altogether. But what we see for John, it's so pivotal. It hinges on, all the sequence of events that come after it hinges on the story itself.
And then he goes to Jerusalem. So then he has this conversation with Martha, and Jesus gives another I am. And Jesus says, listen, your brother's going to rise again. I know, I believe in the resurrection too, Jesus. And Jesus said, no, you don't understand. I am the resurrection. I am the life. So this is another moment. It's like...
So in the context of the resurrection story of Lazarus, Jesus declares, I am the resurrection and I am the life. That is such a core thing for him to declare. It's akin to saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And it's within the context of this Lazarus story that he makes this declaration. And it's such a core declaration to the gospel message, believing that we'll be raised, that if this were a true declaration that were made in the context of a true story, that's so pivotal, that's so instrumental, that's so central to the story about Jesus as depicted in John, this is something that cannot be omitted from the synoptics if it were indeed historical.
This, I am the bread, I am the water, right? I am the light. But here, it's a story about life and death. And so the whole point is Jesus isn't only the fulfillment of these amazing symbols. We're like right back to Genesis 1-3 stuff here. Life and death. Humans experience death and mortality because of the brokenness and evil of our world. And Jesus is life. He is the resurrection and he is the life. So Jesus says that about himself within a narrative where he is going to bring someone back to life from the dead. Are you with me? So it's both a narrative illustration and a claim about Jesus himself that, once again, it's pointing forward to this element right here.
So if the story of Lazarus points to the story of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, it's such an important story. It's so central as it's depicted in John. If it's so central, why isn't it depicted again in the Gospels?
So follow the logic of the story here. So a dear friend of Jesus dies. that's tragic and horrible. So Jesus intentionally delays so that this can become a sign. But
So notice, in this case, Jesus intentionally delays saving his friend. And he's intentionally delaying because if he's saving a sick friend, that's not going to be as great a sign. It's not going to give God as much glory as if he's raising someone from the dead. So he lets his friend die with the plot that God will even be having greater glory through the resurrection. And so it's the indication here is not only is he out of compassion raising someone from the dead, he's letting someone first die with the plan that he'll raise him from the dead after. That's quite the thing to incorporate in the story. That it's all deliberate so that it'll prove and attest to who Jesus is, and then within this whole situation, Jesus can declare, "I am the resurrection and the life." In the context of the story,
is Jesus a welcome presence in and around Jerusalem? How do people feel about Jesus down in Judea? They want to kill him, right? So look at what this gets thematized in the story. It becomes a theme. So in chapter 11, Jesus said, "Hey, let's go down to Judea." "Oh, you can't go there. You're going to die. Don't go. They're going to kill you if you go."
So another element of this story is Jesus is going into danger deliberately, and he's doing an exchange. He's exchanging his life, putting himself in danger, anticipating that he will be killed as a result of this, for saving the life of his friend. And so this is another core element of the story that's very significant. It attests to Jesus giving his life for his friend, and parallels. It not only does it parallel his resurrection, but it parallels. It speaks to him going into the situation, knowing how things will unfold, being the cause and the reason for him being killed.
Go down there. So now all of a sudden, Jesus going to bring life to his friend is now, there's a drama created. Do you see this? Because if he goes to give life to his friend, it will be at the cost of his life. Do you see that? He has to give up his life to save the life of the friend that he loves. And this is a major theme in the story. It just keeps going. So look at what Thomas says when they finally get ready to go. Thomas says, "All right, Jesus is going down to Judea and he's going to die. So this is such like a macho thing."
So they're all on board. Like this is clearly the anticipation is that this is going to result in someone getting killed. So like that's a critical key element that's in there as well.
Like, we'll die with you, Jesus. This kind of thing. You guys, are you with me? All right, it's the martyr syndrome thing. You're right. He's going to go down in glory, kind of thing. So they think that going down to rescue Lazarus means that we're all going to die. And in fact, that's what happens. Look at how. So the story goes: "I'm the resurrection and the life." He goes to the tomb, and think in terms of the narrative, this scene and this scene, there's electricity going on here. Roll back the stone. Yeah?
So you also have the parallels between Lazarus being sealed in a tomb, being wrapped in burial linen shroud, and Jesus being sealed in a tomb and being having a shroud. Electricity, parallels between Lazarus and between the resurrection of Christ, the burial and resurrection of Christ. Undeniable parallels that are in John, completely omitted from the Synoptic Gospels.
This almost becomes a preview of this resurrection scene right here. So they removed the stone. Jesus raised his eyes. Father, I thank you that you've heard me. I know you hear me. But because of the people standing around, I say this so that they may believe that you sent me. Lazarus, come forth. Ooh, he cries out with a loud voice. Jesus cries out with a loud voice 4 times. Yeah, one of them was here. I'm the water. One of them's right here. Come out. And one of them's right here 3 times. Is there a 4th one? Well, this is a little Easter egg for you to go find.
Another Easter egg, the number of times he cries out and the significance of him crying out.
Right, there's at least 3 crying out with a loud voice. Lazarus, come forth. And then look at this. He comes out with all these wrappings. And it just like all this description of the wrappings, right? Are burial wrappings ever going to get talked about again? Yeah, it's going to play a huge feature in this, like how they were all folded and what sections of the tomb they were in. The wrappings, right? This is a narrative preview of Jesus' resurrection.
Yeah, if indeed Lazarus is a narrative preview of Jesus' resurrection, then that's pretty core. That's way more significant than him resurrecting some random person out of sympathy that just spontaneously comes into the story during his ministry, the sequence of events. No, this is a direct parallel with the very death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. And there's just so many layers of symbolism in this story as compared to Christ that if it were true, there's no reason the synoptics would leave it out.
So he comes out, except he's bound in his wrappings. Jesus was definitely not. Unbind him and let him go. Therefore, many of the... Can you keep this kind of thing secret? Many of the Jews who came to Mary saw what he had done. So some believed in him.
It's so spectacular a thing that you can't keep it secret. That's another element of this. That it's the talk of the town. Everyone's talking about it. Lazarus is the center of attention. When Jesus comes in Jerusalem, Lazarus is the center of attention by the Jews as well as those who greet Jesus and say, Hosanna, they lay down palm leaves and he comes in and he's recognized as Messiah. Well, why is he recognized that? Because of the great spectacular miracle of raising Lazarus. The word about this spreads everywhere and is something that isn't some sort of private information that only a few people were privy to. Everyone knew about this. It was the talk of the town.
But others went to the Pharisees and they tattletaled. And so the Pharisees say, well, what are we going to do? The Romans are going to come kill us all if this, upstart king actually gains a following. Then this is the moment where Caiaphas, right, says, that wouldn't be so bad because they could just kill one guy on behalf of us all. He had no idea what he was talking about, you guys, but he was actually prophesying about Jesus' death. Oh yeah, not just for Israel, but for all of those other sheep that God wants to bring into the fold. He's going to be dying for those guys too. So, oh yeah, and that was the day that Lazarus' death was reported, that they started to make a plan to kill him. Okay. Therefore, Jesus, no, so good. So notice how he's wrapping this all together here. This story becomes a preview of this set of events. This is a narrative moment where Jesus is laying down his life for his sheep. Are you with me? Which is what the Good Shepherd does right here. So he lays, and in 13, greater love has no man than this. And he laid down his life for his friend. Yep. So Jesus symbolically and literally is laying down his life for a friend. Which is, can you imagine a better transition narrative into this section of the book right here? It's of Jesus doing and embodying the very things he was talking about here in the story.
Yeah, so to review, the Raising of Lazarus has so many points of significance. And if you compare that to like the widow's son in Luke 7, like this is just this is at a whole nother level, like the whole order of magnitude, more symbolic, more significant, as it's being portrayed in the Gospel of John. This resurrection of Lazarus is according to an elaborate set of events. Two, the person he raises is his beloved disciple, the brother of Mary who anointed Jesus, and Martha, who Jesus also loved. So this is part of his community. This is a familiar acquaintance, someone, the brother of two sisters whom he all loves. It's not, a random person who needs help. So it's the significance of people involved in his ministry. Jesus knows Lazarus is ill and engages in a plot to let him die so that a greater sign may be demonstrated through the situation. So not only does he raise someone, he lets him die knowing that he will raise him afterwards. Really, really interesting. Number 4, Jesus knew he was subjecting himself to danger by going to Judea after the Jews wanted to stone him. So he's knowingly putting himself in danger. Jesus uses the situation to make a declaration about himself. I am the resurrection and the life. Lazarus was in the tomb for 4 days. This is a similar period to how long Jesus was dead. We can see it's paralleling the death of Jesus, the burial and death of Jesus. It's a higher level of being more embellished because it's not like he was dead minutes or hours ahead of time. This is 4 days after he started to decompose, potentially. Lazarus was wrapped in a burial shroud and was sealed in a tomb, similar to Jesus. The miracle sets in motion the plot to arrest Jesus. The Jews also want to kill Lazarus. So, like Lazarus is so well known that even the Jews are after Lazarus as well. And the crowds gathered at the triumphal entry on account of the raising of Lazarus. Lazarus is given as the reason why the crowds gathered and greeted Jesus as he came in to town. And both of these are meant, both Lazarus and Jesus are meant to die so that God may be glorified. Both are signs. And it's the climax of Jesus' ministry before his crucifixion. It's the key transition story from the first part to the second part, from the signs to the book of glory, which incorporates the last meal, last words, trial, crucifixion, and resurrection. In John, so much hinges on the story of the raising of Lazarus. It's the center of attention of the Jews and followers. And so when you have a story that has this much of a meaning and is this critical to the story, pivotal to the story overall of Jesus's ministry, if this were indeed the case, then there's just it's unquestionably this would be added to the synoptics. But we see in Luke, there's a story about the widow's son being raised to life, and it's not the same comparison because it doesn't have the symbolism and the parallels and all of the implications that this Lazarus story does. So Luke trying to convey the historical narrative of Jesus' ministry, how it actually unfolded. If this were indeed the case, the raising of Lazarus, there's no reason Luke would omit that.
Answered them, typical like cryptic riddle. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. The Son of Man is going to rise up and be exalted on his throne beside the Ancient of Days. Yeah, Daniel 7. But I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Just like, what? So, but do you get it? So the hour of the enthronement of the Son of Man. And then he tells a riddle about how, but new life only comes about when something dies.
So that talking about being exalted, but exalted kind of being flipped, where he's exalted on a cross instead of exalted as King of Kings. And so there's like this riddle metaphorical play on what's going on, where the exalting that actually occurs is an exalting on a cross, as opposed to the Hebrew scriptures, which imply exalted in terms of status and authority.
Now, sorry, he was saying this about being lifted up to indicate how he would die. You guys tracking? Okay, that's good. So who are the two high exalted ones in the book of Isaiah? It's Yahweh, the King of Israel, and it's the servant who dies on behalf of Israel's sins. This is in Isaiah. This is already happening in Isaiah. These two figures are getting superimposed on each other. And so John knows this Hebrew Bible like nobody's business, right? And he's put this together. And so for him, this is the moment where Jesus' exaltation, right? I'm going to be lifted up. It's all about this. It's the last meal. Oh yeah, what's missing in John's retelling of the last meal? The meal. There's no, yeah? Like the cup and the bread, it's not here. And more than likely it's because you can go read about it in the other ones.
So another thing to note is that John omits the Gospel of John omits things that are really important and pivotal in the Synoptic Gospels. So there's really an incompatibility and a disconnect between the two, where things in John are emphasized that are not in the Synoptics, and things in the Synoptics are emphasized that are not in John. So which thing should be emphasized? Well, in John, these things that are emphasized are all symbolic and spiritual truths, as opposed to the historical narrative, whereas the Synoptics work within this historical narrative, especially Luke and Acts, to bring the symbolism in the historical context of what actually occurred. So you have a difference between a spiritualized gospel that's symbolic and the Synoptics, best exemplified by Luke and Acts, which is the historical context of what occurred and the symbolism in reference to the actual historical Jesus and historical unfolding of events.
And then we're into 14 through 17. If you've ever tried to preach through 1 John, you'll know how stinking hard it is, because it doesn't work in a logical flow of thought. It's a cyclical spiral thought. And it's developing, isn't it? It really develops the ideas, but it does it in a very different way than Paul the Apostle does. This section feels exactly the same. There's about 5 core ideas, and he just, boom, he just kind of moves around them in this final discourse. It's the most read letters in the Gospel of John, 14 to 17, just one long speech.
So yeah, in this dialogue, there's four chapters of just Jesus speaking for the most part. And you have to also ask yourself, well, is someone going to convey accurately 4 long chapters of Jesus speaking with precision and accuracy? Or is this John presenting Jesus in terms of how John perceives Jesus and the symbolic identity of who Jesus is, using this dialogue and the prayer and the devices incorporated here? And again, it's a spiral kind of thing. It doesn't flow logically in a linear manner. It's a very sort of circular spiral type of unfolding of themes and concepts in the dialogue. And
then declaring it's done. And holy cow, like this is just a cool thing right here. This little word here under finish, you can see it down at the bottom. It's pronounced teleo. It occurs about half a dozen times. It's another soccer ball. Teleo is another soccer ball moved down the field. Multiple times in here, Jesus will talk about finishing my work. The Father sent me to finish the work. I'm here to finish the work. It's not quite finished, but it's going to. And he talks about, so the work and the finishing the work, it's a whole theme. And then here it all comes to its culmination right here. That's a whole, like, you could riff off that.
It's for this reason that Origen saw John's portrait of Jesus as sometimes only symbolic. Origen, in his commentary on John, said, "We must first inquire as to what the office of the evangelist, and mark that it is not only to narrate how the Savior cured a man or was blind from his birth, or raised a dead man who was already stinking, or to state what his extraordinary works he wrought, and the office of the evangelist being thus defined, we shall not hesitate to find gospel in such discourse, also as is not narrative, but oratory, and intended to strengthen belief in the mission of Christ." So Origen identified John as an evangelistic document, not as a historiography, and that he being studied, being one of the earlier theologians, having written about 2,000 treatises, he could see that this was more symbolic than historical. We have 100 years of critical scholarship, which is surveyed and peer-reviewed and summarized in this book. The conclusion is John is to be regarded more symbolic than historical. This is what James Dunn affirmed when he said, "Few scholars would regard John as a source for information regarding Jesus' life and ministry to any degree comparable to the Synoptics. On the whole, then, the position is unchanged." What position? Well, the critical scholarship from 100 years of looking at John critically and analyzing it, and coming up with the conclusion that John's gospel cannot be regarded as a source for the life and the teaching of Jesus of the same order as the Synoptics. We shall certainly want to call upon John's gospel as a source, but mostly as a secondary source to supplement and corroborate the testimony of the Synoptic traditions. So James Dunn is affirming the position that's unchanged, that John is a secondary source, a supplemental source, as opposed to the first place to go for the historical Jesus. Taking a few additional quotes from James Dunn. As far as the final form of the gospel itself is concerned, it would appear that John felt free to mold the tradition available to him in his own distinctive way. Of this raising of Lazarus from the dead, none of the other evangelists show any awareness. So he says it's hard to avoid the conclusion that John moved the account of the cleansing of the temple to the beginning of his gospel to provide a window through which the unfolding of Jesus' mission and revelation should be seen. And that he did so also to make room for his own version of the climax of Jesus' mission, his own version of the climax to Jesus' mission, the climax which triggered the decisive action against Jesus. More has to be said about the raising of Lazarus, but it is best said in the context of John's accounts of Jesus' signs. It is quite possible then to envision how the Johannine word wisdom Christology is the product of a long reflection of such features of the earliest Jesus tradition. In light of Jesus' resurrection and exaltation to the right hand of God, as they believed, it was natural to see fuller and deeper significance in such features, and natural to develop a richer expression of them within the gospel framework already established by the Synoptic Gospels. Were the question of historicity a real one for John and his audiences in the same way as is the case today, he would probably have confirmed that it was not attempting to provide a historical record of what Jesus did and said. So James Dunn here is saying it wasn't expected that this be historical, and if it was, he would have done more to clarify it's not historical. His concern was rather to bring out the truth of Jesus as they now had perceived it, that is, in a later Christological development, the fuller significance of the historical life and mission of Jesus, which only became clear to them with the passing of some decades. So it's looking in retrospect of laying out the significance of the historical life and mission of Jesus as it was seen after the passing of some decades. For John, the truth of Jesus was much fuller and richer than the historical facticity of what he said and did during the 3 years of his mission. To miss this probable conclusion and to insist that John has to be read on the same terms as the level of the synoptics is most likely to miss the John of what John saw himself doing. So, the choice is yours. You can regard John as symbolic, or you can regard John as historical and continue to proceed, with the presumption, the presuppositions of tradition. But even from an early age, scholars and theologians could understand that John is symbolic, and it's not historically complementary or compatible, but by and large, the signs, the narratives in John are more symbolic than they are historical. So you have the option. You can take the red pill or the blue pill. I've taken the red pill. That's not the easy choice because you're going to get under fire. But if you do, then you can be someone who pursues the truth, no matter what the consequences, who can enter the matrix and fight to reform and bring restoration to the faith in terms of getting back to the reforms in first century apostolic Christianity. Those who are brave are the heroes. I've taken a lot of fire for coming out with this, for expressing my views on this, my conviction, for advocating that we take a more sensible approach to identifying foundational authorities as those which can be historically defended. It's not going to be easy. I didn't say it would be easy, but I said it would be the truth. And so I'd like to close by reading a passage from Luke where Jesus spoke. And he said, "Truly I say to you, no prophet is acceptable in his hometown. But in truth I tell you, there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heavens were shut up for 3 years and 6 months. And a great famine came over all the land. And Elijah was sent to none of them, but only Zarephath in the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. And there were many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha. And none of them were cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian. And when those who heard these things, all in the synagogues were filled with wrath, and they rose up and drove him out of town and brought him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they could throw him down the cliff. But passing through their midst, he went away." And so Jesus is a truth teller. He's saying things that are unpopular, that the audience doesn't want him to hear. And you can say I'm doing the same thing. I'm saying I'm bringing forth evidence and a witness to the truth that some people don't want to hear. And it's not the easy position to take, but I think it's the correct position to move forward in ministry, in evangelism, and apologetics. We need to come back to a more solid, defensible foundation for defending our faith, and not introducing a bunch of presumptions into the faith that aren't really essential or core to being a believer. Praise God. I'm going to continue to take the fire and pursue the truth. So I hope and I pray that others will join me in this endeavor, and we can get back to the roots of first century apostolic Christianity. Be a hero, and praise the Lord. So that concludes my presentation. Hallelujah. I pray that it was a blessing. I pray that it was insightful, that it helped give you more perception and insight into what's going on with the Gospel of John. Thanks for watching. Thanks for commenting and participating. Much love. Until next time, God bless you. Have a wonderful day. Much love.